name is Diksha Awasthi, and I work with Taylor & Francis Group at F1000. And Taylor & Francis Group is a part of Informa Business, and F1000 is part of Taylor & Francis Open Access Publishing portfolio. And I work as an assistant manager business liaison with F1000 team in India. And today we are going to talk about how to publish on F1000. So one second, I'll just move. Everyone can see my screen? If
yes, we can see.
Okay, perfect, great. So just a brief outline of the workshop, and I'm going to speak very slowly so that everyone can understand what I'm saying, and we can take up all the questions towards the end of the presentation. So you can drop your questions in the chat box, and then we can take them towards the end. So to begin with, I will talk about F1000 publishing model and the various article options that are there for the researchers to publish on F1000. Then again, I will going to highlight how do you publish on F1000, the step-by-step process from the submission to till the time when the article is actually published, and editorial and data policies, because it's very important for the researchers to understand the various policies and compliance checks that we do in F1000 Research. And I will also highlight how can researchers submit on Quvae Gateway, which is a part of F1000 Research. And then towards the end, we will take up question and answers. So just to begin with, I will start with our publishing model. So as you can see on our screen, we refer to a publishing model as beyond open access. And that's because open access is the foundation block and the end point. And anything we publish will have a CC BY license, which is a Creative Commons Zero license, which allows you to share your research findings easily without any legal implications. And it also means that your research will be openly accessible to all. But when we say that we are beyond this, we really want to open up as much of the publishing and research process as we can, with the core aim of maximizing use and reuse of research, which is what open access and open research essentially stands for. Now, the publishing model that I will detail here applies to any peer-reviewed articles that are submitted to F1000 Research. Now, whenever a paper is submitted to F1000 Research, it is first checked by our in-house editorial team for paper's suitability and eligibility. Now, assuming that the article has passed these criteria, it is sent to our typesetters and can be published online. Now, at this point, the paper is published, but not peer-reviewed. Now, this is one way how we differ from the traditional journals, which do the peer review first and then publish. What we do is that we reverse this model. Now, the published article is clearly marked as awaiting peer review, but it will already be assigned a DOI, which is a digital object identifier, and it is immediately available to the wider community to be read and cited, and is also indexed in the Google Scholar. Now, after the publication, the peer review stage is initiated. Now, this process is led by the authors, such as yourselves. So you can propose reviewers or can seek reviewers suggested by our system as long as they meet our criteria. Now, we have editorial criteria and also peer review criteria, which I'm going to highlight towards the end of the presentation as well. So our editorial team also ensures that there are no conflict of interest between authors and the reviewers. Now, any reviewer report that we receive are also published online alongside the detail of the reviewers' names and affiliations. Now, because the article has already been published, the reviewers are asked to focus on technical aspects and soundness of the paper rather than doing any subjective assessment. Now, authors can choose to revise their paper. So we have a functionality called article versioning. So as and when the reviewers review the paper, leave their comments, the authors can choose to revise those papers accordingly, address and respond to those reviewers' comments. And they can select of the three statuses, which is approved, approved with reservations, and not approved. So these essentially means the green tick means that the reviewer has approved the paper. The question mark means that the reviewer has some reservations, but mostly they like the paper, but they leave some comments. So if you address those comments, they will then approve the paper. And the cross is not approved. Even when the reviewer says not approved and gives a cross, they leave a comment for the author to address. So if the author addresses those comments, then the reviewer might change their status to either approved or approve with reservation. So this keeps on happening once the article is published. And for a paper to be indexed on Scopus, PubMed, and other indexers like DOAJ and etc., the paper needs to have 2 approved statuses. So 2 reviewers need to approve, which means 2 green tick, or it needs to have 1 approved and 2 approved with reservation. So 1 green tick or 2 question mark. So this is the minimum criteria for a paper to be sent to the indexers. Now moving on. Is my screen changing? Sorry, I think. One second. Yeah. Can you see the next slide?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, perfect. So just wanted to highlight the different kind of article options that we have on F1000Research. And it's a very unique aspect of our model that we support publication of a diversity of peer-reviewed article options. Now, the idea here is that we want to open up the research process by enabling a range of different publication type. So this is in addition to the standard articles like the research essay. Excuse me. The aim is to support the use, reuse, and reproducibility of the research. So you can see here that we support the researchers at every stage of their journey in the research life cycle, even when they're conceptualizing or planning the research or collecting data, analyzing the piece of research, or even engaging with a wider audience. So at any point, there are different article options that you can submit on F1000. Now moving on here, that was the entire description of the publication process from submission to indexing. But for all that to happen, your article must first pass our in-house editorial checks, which is what we are going to talk about here in more detail. So these checks are called pre-publication checks, and I will take you through each one of them. So please note that the articles must pass all of these checks to be published on F1000Research. So the very first one is, what are the various requirements for submission? Now, this is just the overview of the editorial requirements. First will be the pre-publication checks. Then we will talk about ethical and consent requirements that must be followed. And then we will talk about the data and materials policy and various other requirements. Now, what is the purpose of doing pre-publication check? Because we publish the paper before peer review, as I mentioned earlier, we have to ensure that each article meets a certain standard. Now, this means that checking that the article is readable, that it is reproducible, that it adheres to the ethical standards and F1000's guidelines and policies. Now, these checks are more substantial than any other publishers require at this point. Now, again, why do we do this? Because we publish before peer review and we want to provide the readers and those who will be invited to review with as much assurance around the credentials of the work at this early stage. So you can see on your screen that this is the reason why we do all the pre-publication checks. Now, what is the process of the pre-pub checks? The author submits an article. An in-house editor who's not an academic editor will be assigned and make an initial decision on the article based on a number of checks that I will discuss on the next slide. Now, once the editor has made a decision, they send the article back to the author to revise in line with the editor's comments. We ask that authors return their revisions promptly. So the sooner the author revises their paper and send it back, the sooner it can be published on our website. So there may be multiple cycles of revision if there are major changes or major comments which are still outstanding. Once all the comments are addressed, the editor will prepare the article for typesetting and send it to the production team. So at that stage, the author will receive an email saying that your manuscript has been accepted for publication or conditionally accepted for publication. So at that point, the manuscript has already been sent to the typesetters for further clarification, and then it will be published on our portal. Now, what do we check for in the manuscript? So suppose you're an author and you've submitted onto me and I'm the editor for the paper. So these are some of the things that I will check. First, I will check that at least one author must be a qualified researcher, which means that typically they should have a graduate degree and at least some existing publication record, which is already there, that we can check through the ResearchGate profile and your articles on Scopus and other databases. Now, second, that your work must be original. Of course, we won't accept manuscripts which are highly plagiarized. So your work has to be original, must not have been published previously or be under consideration or review by any other journal. So you cannot publish papers that you have published in some other journal on F1000Research. We also use a plagiarism detection software, which is called Authenticate, to ensure that the work is original. Now, any text in the article that has been previously published anywhere else must have quotation marks and a reference to the original source. So just how you cite the article, or else it has to be paraphrased with the reference to the original source. Manuscripts that were previously posted on a preprint servers are welcome. So if you have published any of your manuscript on any of the archive which are preprint servers, those manuscripts you can submit on F1000 because we accept preprints. Now, third point is that the article must be written in clear English. We do not provide any in-house language improvement services. Therefore, the article must already be of a high language quality before submission. You can find a list of recommended English language copy editing services as well. Our editorial team does do slightly copy edit, so they will lightly copy edit your article for any minor language errors, but we do not do a heavy copy editing. So that part the author needs to take care of. So what is the points that we check for next? So the reported study must also meet all applicable research and publication standards like consort guidelines, CARE guidelines, or SAGA guidelines. So especially if you're doing clinical trials, consort is the guidelines, that checklist you need to follow and fill out and then submit. So ensuring that the ethical approval is clearly stated. I will talk about ethical approval in a moment. And adhering to our data availability policy, where all the underlying data and the results should be provided in an open online data repository, which again, I will talk in a couple of minutes. Now, moving on to ethical approval. To go into ethical approval in more detail for all the studies involving humans. Now, when I say human subjects, I mean anything from drug experimentation to interviews to online surveys. We require an ethical approval statement. Now, ethical approval should have been obtained prior to the study being conducted. You may also need to apply for ethical approval for certain animal studies. And if you did not need ethical approval for your study, you will need a clear statement in the article that explains why your study did not require that you obtain ethical approval. Now, in the screenshot on your slide, you can see a very good example of an ethics statement from an article. It has very clearly stated what are the information that is required, which is the institution, the review board name, permit number. So all these ethical considerations need to be clearly stated. Even it is required in social sciences research as well. So if you're submitting a survey, an interview, or a questionnaire, or anything involves data from the humans, even if it is online or in person, it needs to have an ethical approval statement. Moving on. So going to consent requirements for human studies, we also require that consent to participate has been sought from all the participants. Now you should include a consent statement in your article to detail that you obtained consent and what type of consent did you obtain, which means Was it a written informed consent or was it a verbal consent? Now, if you are publishing any identifiable data, you will need to have obtained consent to publish from the participants. Now you can see some example here of how a consent statement looks like. So written informed consent for the creation and publication of this report was provided, was taken from the patient. So it has to be very clearly stated. Now, if the participants in your study are minors, which means that they are children or otherwise cannot give consent, for example, they have reduced mental capacity, you still must obtain a written informed consent either from a parent in case of children or a legal guardian in case of people with reduced mental capacity. So consent requirement needs to be there. Now, moving on. So this is just a list of all the checks that we do at pre-publication stage. This is a lot of information, so I'm not going to go through it one by one, but I'll be happy to share the presentation with all of you, with Dr. Tina, so you can see for yourself what are the various checks required and spend some time reading through them. So just to give a brief outline, the first one talks about the authorship criteria. And the next one is originality, which talks about the software that we use, which is Authenticate, and also how much of the percentage of plagiarism is acceptable, which is 10% from individual sources. Language, authors will be asked to have articles professionally copy edited if the article is not readable. Then what are the various reporting guidelines that are applicable? Ethics statement, I've just mentioned what exactly an ethics and consent statement are. Data availability, I will talk about in a minute. And what are the other general checks, which is that abstract does not exceed 300 words. So if it is a research article, abstract has to be structured, which means there should be background, method, result, and conclusion. Grant information statement has to be provided. So if you are a grantee from any institution that they're paying you to conduct a research, they're giving you a certain amount of grant, that information needs to be input, which is the institution, grant number, and to whom it was granted, which means if any of your co-authors are receiving that grant, so you can mention that detail. What are the competing interests? If the authors have any competing interest with any third party or within each other, they need to declare them. And there's some information on the figures. So if you have any figures or tables in your research paper, so they need to be of good quality and they need to be de-identified, and correct permissions for reuse need to be there. And figures and tables should have titles and legends at the main body of the text. So don't worry too much about this particular slide. I will share it later so you can spend some time looking at it. Now, from here, I would like to talk about open data policies and requirements. And this is an important section because open data is something that every author needs to understand why we are asking for the data to be declared openly and how do you do that. And here I will also talk about the different type of data set, which is underlying data and extended data. Now, just quickly spending some time on talking about the benefits of transparent and open data. Now, as well as the requirements of open data policy, it's worth pointing out why do we ask for the researchers to share their data openly in the first place. So sharing your data openly helps you boost your credibility as a researcher. So others can replicate on your research and validate the results that you're reporting. Now, when data is shared in a data repository, the profile and visibility of your work also increases. Now, other researchers can find your research both on the journal and the publishing platform and via the data repository where the data set is stored. And sharing data in a repository is also associated with increased citations for your research paper. So there have been a lot of studies conducted which show that publishing in open research and open access and sharing your data openly has increased citations of the paper. Now, as a researcher, we understand that some of the researchers think if they share their data openly, what about copyright? What if somebody else plagiarizes my data? What if somebody else takes my data and declares it as their own? Now, one needs to understand, if you share your data and deposit it in a secure, community recognized repository, you will receive a something called DOI, which is a digital object identifier, which is unique to your data set, unique to your piece of research. So if any of the other researcher stumbles upon your data set, they will have to cite your name as a researcher. They will have to cite your data set. Otherwise, it will be plagiarism in their paper. So you will receive credit, you will receive the credibility if anyone cites your paper, and you will have the sole copyright of that data set, so that researchers are aware of this important information when sharing their data openly. Now, we are talking about data, but what exactly is research data? Research data may either be the input or the output of your research process, depending on the design of your study, and the format of this data will depend on this design as well as your research discipline. So if you are a researcher in life sciences, your data set will be different as compared to somebody who is a researcher in social sciences background. So data set in spreadsheets, which are Excel sheets, is fairly common. But data can also take the form of images, videos, audio recordings. If you've done any interviews and you've recorded them on your phone, so that also constitutes data. So it's entirely dependent on your research and the study. So it's a very wide term that we use here, data. But what is open data? Now, open data is a phrase that we use a lot on F1000. So it's important that authors have a clear understanding of what it means to them. Open data, as the name suggests, refers to the accessibility of that data. The data must be visible to all our readers, meaning that it should be stored somewhere publicly to allow unlimited access. Now, this is similar to the concept of OA Libre in open access publishing, which means that the output can be accessed openly. Now, just to give you a brief idea of what the FAIR guidelines are, essentially FAIR principles mean findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. These are mandated guidelines that F1000 follows. So the acronym stands for FAIR. There are a number of simple steps that you can take to make your data more fair. All of these recommendations align with the guidance provided in F1000 data guidelines. Findable means that to include a persistent identifier in your data availability statement linked to your data repository. I'll tell you how to do that in a minute. Accessible means that using a recommended data repository which is accessible and open. Interoperable means that to use any applicable reporting standards, vocabularies, ontologies which are common in your discipline. And reusable means to include a standard license for your data. Now, as researchers, you must be aware that there are different kind of licenses. Some are for commercial use, CC BY license or CC0 BY license are licenses which you use when you want to make your data and your result open, and you have to have a Creative Commons license, which essentially means that if somebody else reads your work or downloads it or reproduces, replicates it in their study, it won't have any legal implications. So moving on to F1000 open data guidelines. So there are a number of elements which aim to make data which is shared alongside published articles accessible and reusable. To ensure that the data is accessible, we require a data availability statement explaining how that data can be accessed. Now that must be shared in a data repository. Reusable data must be openly licensed, and the data should ideally be shared in a way that it complies with the FAIR principles that I just outlined in the previous slide. We also want the data creators to get credit for their data. So data sets should be cited in the body of the article wherever relevant and added to the reference list or bibliography. Now, all of these requirements are checked at the pre-publication stage by the editorial team, And the data set will be accessed by the peer reviewers also when they are going to review your paper. Now, like I talked about the pre-publication checks from the editorial front, these are the pre-publication checks when it comes to the open data policy. Now, how does it looks like in theory? When the author submits their article, editorial checks for policy compliance is initiated, and I provided you with the list in a couple of previous slides. Then the article is made public. And once the article is made public, the peer review stage is initiated. Now, these are some of the checks that the pre-publication check ensures that the paper is readable, reproducible, adheres to our publishing guidelines and policies. Now, pre-publication checks which are open in nature, data must be shared for all the articles unless there is a valid exemption, which I will share in a couple of minutes. What are the various valid exemptions? Data must be available in one of our F1000 recommended repositories with an open license, which I've mentioned here, which is CC0 or CC BY license, and a persistent identifier. And all articles must include a statement describing how that data can be accessed by peer reviewers and readers. I will give you an example of how it looks like in a minute. Now, these are some of the valid exemptions and exceptions that we have. Now, first exemption is authors who did not generate or use the data. Second exemption is data which cannot be shared for ethical or security reason, which could be to protect the privacy of your research participants. Third, that data sets which are too large to upload to a repository. Fourth is that data owned by third party, which was reused by the author. So these are the 4 exemptions that we allow on F1000. So if your paper and your data study falls under any of these 4 categories, you can apply for an exemption. However, if you feel that you have some data which you cannot share and the exemption does not fall within these 4 categories, you can reach out to me or anyone from the editorial team, and they will be able to help you out and make you understand, help you understand if your data set falls under exemptions or not. Now, this is just a screenshot from our website. So if you go to f1000research.com, I will drop in the link in the chat box after the presentation. Click on how to publish, then scroll down to data guidelines. You will come across the list, which you can see on the other side of your screen, of all the recommended repositories that we have on F1000. So it could be Triad, which accepts any data type. So on one side, it's mentioned all the different data types that these repositories accept. One of the most recommended is Figshare, which is very easy to use, and a lot of researchers do use that, or Harvard Dataverse, Open Science Framework, Zenodo is for mixed data and code. So it's clearly mentioned which repository is for what type of data set. Now, what do authors need to do? This is again important when you're thinking about how you can comply with F1000 open data policy. It is also important to note some of the preparatory steps that you will need to take before you submit your article or even before you start your research. Now, at the beginning of your research project, you may need to draft a data management plan. Now, in some cases, your funder will prompt you to create this plan as part of your grant funding submission. If you do create a data management plan, it will help you with all the decisions that you make to prepare your data for sharing as you conduct your research. Now, at this point, you may also consider where your future data set will be stored. For example, which data repository you will use. Again, this will help to guide you when you think about documenting your data set for future sharing. Now, before you submit the data set to a repository, you will need to prepare it for appropriate sharing, which means that your study involved human research participants. You will need to anonymize the data before it can be shared. Additionally, you will need to write some descriptive text to accompany your data set into the repository, which is the metadata. And you may also wish to check that the data itself will be understood by other people. So if I am reading your data and you are the researcher, you will have to make sure that all the headers don't include any acronyms that you have not explained, and that the unit of measurement have been defined and are consistent throughout. So these minor details need to be taken care of. Now, when you're ready with your data, you will upload that in a repository. And then when it has been deposited, you can draft your data availability statement in your manuscript when you are submitting to your gateway. Now, just to give you an idea of what are the different type of data in your study. Now, underlying data means that data that underlie the results of the study. So it can either be the raw data that you have accumulated or the source data. What is raw data? Raw data is all the output data the authors have gathered in their study. For example, uncropped Western blots, survey results, sequences, transcripts, spectra. So all of this comprises raw data. Authors must upload all of this data to the repository, which I had shown you, Dataverse, Figshare, etc. What is source data? Source data is all the input data that the authors analyzed in their study. For example, data set used from other researchers, demographic health survey data that you have analyzed within your study. So authors need to provide information about where they obtained this source data. So you can see what the difference is between the raw data and the source data here. Now there's another type of data which is called extended data. Extended data means material which is equivalent to your supplementary material. For example, questionnaires, consent statements, statistical analysis, calculation, all of this comes in the extended data. Authors can choose to share this information, but they do not need to provide any materials that do not impact the reproducibility of the results. Authors must upload all of these to a data repository. Now moving on to reporting guidelines. So certain study types also require reporting guidelines, especially in clinical trials, which are the consort guidelines, which are for clinical trials. Then you have SPIRIT guidelines, which are for clinical trial protocols, PRISMA guidelines, which are for systemic reviews, PRISMA P for systemic reviews protocols, and ARRIVE guidelines, which are for in vivo animal studies. Now, these reporting guideline checklists should be filled out and all the information provided in the article. And this checklist must also be uploaded to the data repository. Now, this is just a screenshot of our submission page. So if you go to F1000Research and if you're submitting on Quvae gateway, we click on submit to your gateway. And when you are uploading your manuscript and all the required information, under the data section, this is what will appear. So the first screenshot here, you can see we have clearly stated what is underlying data, what is extended data, what are the reporting guideline checklists. So what I told you right now is already on our website as well. And then here is two questions that they ask you. One is, have you prepared your data for appropriate sharing? So if you click yes, some or all of my data can be shared, it will lead you to this other information where it says, please supply the detail for each data set associated with this article. So in the first one, you will mention the link to your data set. So here you can see that it's a DOI, which is a digital object identifier. And the link to the repository says Figshare. And then here, it's a title of your data set, which is GP responses on working from home. Then again, there's a link to your data set, which is this similar one as above. The repository name is Figshare, where you're submitting it, F1000Research, and what kind of data it is, which is underlying data. So from the drop down, you can choose underlying or extended, and what are the licenses that you would want to provide to your data. So here, the author has provided CC0 license. And on the other side, you can see if you click on no, what will happen. So the first example was, yes, you want to share my data. Second, no, I don't want to share my data, or I did not use the data. So here again, you will have to specify the reason why your data cannot be shared. So the first one is that there is no data associated with the article. For example, if you're writing a review article, so you can click here. Then there are some ethical or security concerns about your data. So you can click on the second option. Or third is data protection issue. So if there is some issues and under legal implication, you can't share your data, you can click on the third option. And then there are two more other options, too large and provided by third party. So these are exemptions that you can avail if you cannot share your data. All of this you can find on our website. I will share the link to this particular page as well. Now, what is a data availability statement? Every article needs to have a data availability statement. So if any one of you have published on F1000Research, you would know what a data availability statement is. And an example of which is also on your screen as a screenshot from a paper, how it looks like in practice. It will appear towards the end of your paper, which is after the conclusion. You can see data availability, underlying and extended data, and reporting guidelines. All the three information is clearly mentioned. And some of the examples are also there, so I'll just show you. Now, this is an example with underlying raw data. So how will you mention that? So you have the Figshare title, your DOI. The project contains following underlying data. So what is the file name? If it is raw and average PCR data or raw Western blot images. So all of the information is here. And the license image information is also here. So it's Creative Commons 0, no rights reserved data waiver. What are the key requirements? Subheading for what type of data it is, the repository name, title of your data set, the URL, the citation, and information about the files in the repository, and then the licenses. So this is for underlying data. Here is an example of how it looks like in a repository. So we have used Figshare repository here to show you how exactly it looks like when you are uploading it. All of the information is here. And on the next side, you can see how it appears when you're drafting it. So you have the Figshare detail, you have the DOI, you have the citation and information on what type of license it is. So all of the information is very clearly stated. Now, the next example is about the extended data. So you have the key requirements, which are subheading for what type of data it is, the name of the repository, the title of the data set, the DOI, citation, information about the file in the repository, and the license. So here you can see that again, it's Figshare, what is the title of your project, the DOI, then what is the extended data? There are supplementary figures and tables in questionnaire. So it's very clearly stated, supplementary table 1, figure 2, figure 1, and the questionnaire. So this is an ideal example of extended data. Here you can see an example from a published article on F1000Research, how it appears on your article. So this is how it will appear. Same format that we see that we saw in the previous slide. The name of the title, DOI, what all extending data is there. So there are tables, table 1 to table 6, and then there are 3 figures. All of this is very clearly mentioned. So it's very easy, very simple to do that, and this is how it appears. Now, if you are uploading an article which comes with a data exemption, the 4 points that I mentioned, even then you will need to write a data availability statement, and it must contain why the data is restricted, all the necessary information required for a reader to apply for access. So if it is stored in a restricted repository, how can you apply for the access, the conditions under which that access will be granted, and the requirements depending on the exemption. Now here is an example of a data availability statement, which is a restricted data. So you can see that the data set can be accessed by completing the request form, which requires that the intended use for data is specified. So if you are a researcher, you want to access the data on the ophthalmologists in training in Eastern, Central, and Southern Africa, you need to apply for the access, get the request form, and share your intention behind using the data. Now, these are some generic examples of the data availability statement, so I'll quickly go through them. This is the first one where your data is clearly available for anyone to use and reuse. It has a CC0 public domain license. You can see that it is very clearly mentioned that the data is in the form of Excel spreadsheet, and it is shared for everyone. This is the second example, which is a restricted data availability example. So you need to register, and only then people who are reading your article will get access to your data set only for legitimate research purposes. If there is no data, this is how it looks like. You still need to draft a data availability statement which says no data are associated with this article. So that was a summary of that was the whole talk on the data, different types of data policies that we have on F1000, the editorial checks. So just to summarize it all, as far as the editorial checks are required, all articles submitted for peer review must meet all our pre-publication checks and editorial requirements to be accepted for publication. Ethical and consent requirements must be followed. Any underpinning data that we talked about right now, underlying or extended data, should be fair and described in a data availability statement. And if you have any question whatsoever, we have a dedicated editorial team and a dedicated business liaison team who sits in India office and APAC region as well as across the globe that will help you out as a researcher. So at any point you have any questions regarding how to submit on F1000, or if you're not sure how to describe your data or upload your data into any of the repository, you can write to me, reach out to us, and we'll be able to help you and guide you through that process. So it's very simple, but if you need any information, please feel free to reach out. Now, this brings me to the last section of this presentation, and after that, I'll be happy to take up the questions. I can see that there are a lot on the chat. So just a few more moments and we can get to the questions. Now, how does our peer review selection look like in practice? The peer review process that we have is open peer review, open transparent peer review process. It is not blind or double blind. It is open in nature, and it is post publication. So once a paper is published, then we do the peer review, and after the peer review, we index your paper. So this is the standard timeline that we follow. Now, reviewers are invited based on author suggestion. So if any one of you have submitted to F1000, if your paper has been accepted or conditionally accepted for publication, the editorial team will ask you to submit a list of potential peer reviewers to peer review your paper. So this is how it works. We believe that authors know who is the best qualified to review the paper, and all the review is done in the open. So it is plain to see if any imbalances occur. Peer reviewers get visibility and credit for all their comments, and we collect their ORCID IDs for reviewers, which we directly link to the reviewer's ORCID ID. So here it means that if you are a peer reviewer with F1000, your review report is also citable and you have the full credibility because your name, your affiliation is very clearly mentioned. So when you submit an article to us, it is helpful that you have considered in advance who you think would be a useful reviewer for your work. Some steps on how to do that: you can check people who are attending the same conferences as yours or publishing in the similar journals, or you can check the bibliography or reference list of any paper which are within your subject areas. Now, one point that I want to mention here is that we operate on an author-led model, which means that authors are solely responsible for suggesting reviewers. However, there is something called Reviewer Finder tool, which is an algorithmic tool that you will get access to if you submit your paper with us, from which you can find a list of potential reviewers as well. So that is one tool that will help you find the reviewers. And if you have any question regarding the best practices to find peer reviewers, you can always reach out to a peer review team that will be able to help you. But the peer reviewer team within the editorial team will liaise between the author and the reviewer to make sure that the process is running smoothly. We also check reviewer suggestions for suitability and are responsible for publishing peer review reports for your article. But please do not contact your reviewers at any point in the peer review process. If you wish for a reviewer to review, you can let us know. You can let the peer review team know. The only communication between the author and the reviewer should be through the peer review report and in the comment section. So the authors are not recommended to reach out to the peer reviewers and ask them to review their paper, because then that will be peer review manipulation. So we do not accept that. That goes against the publishing ethics for any journal whatsoever, not only F1000. So authors are recommended not to reach out to the peer reviewers on their own, but just suggest us a list and we'll take care of the rest. Now, just the last slide. What is our peer review criteria? The peer reviewers should typically hold a doctorate degree, which is a PhD, MD, MBBS or equivalent degree. They need to be an expert in the field. So they should have published at least 3 articles as the lead author or any of the corresponding authors as well in a relevant topic, with at least 1 article having been published in the last 5 years. So total 3 publications, out of which 1 should be in the last 5 years. Reviewers should not have any competing interests that can bias their assessment of the article. Of course, there shouldn't be any bias or any competing interest or conflict of interest. Peer reviewers need to be global from different institutions, just not only your institution or your geography, but from all over the world. So we have diversity in the peer review process. And in case where we receive multiple reviewer suggestions from the same country, the editorial team can only invite one of these reviewers at a time. So if you are from Thailand and you are suggesting reviewers just from Thailand, we will only be able to invite 1 reviewer from Thailand, and rest 4 or 5 need to be from other geographies, right? So how to submit on Quvae research? Now, most of you must be aware of that we have a gateway with Quvae research services on F1000Research. I'll just drop in a link after the presentation. This is the page of that research. And here where I have circled, this is where you click to submit to this gateway, and you can submit your research on Quvae. And if there are any questions, of course, the whole editorial and data policies that we have talked about will apply when you're submitting onto this gateway as well. But if there are any questions, please do reach out. And with this, I will end my presentation and answer any questions that you have. Thank you. I'm just going to stop sharing so that I can see the questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. There are a couple of questions on the chat. I can. If somebody could translate some of these questions, that would be very helpful. Or if anyone else would like to answer, because there are none in English.
Dr. Kukiat, you can translate now if there is any questions.
I'm scrolling down, but I cannot see any questions from Thailand.
Okay, perfect.
You can type any questions you would like to ask in the chat box. ถามได้เลยนะครับ I can see we have audience from different countries.
I am dropping my email ID on the chat, and I will also share the link to F1000Research and the gateway link as well.
Thank you so much.
So if there are any questions later on, please do reach out to us and we'd be able to help you out.
I don't think any questions are there, Diksha.
Okay, perfect. So I will share the slides in a form of PDF with you, Dr. Tina, if you want to send
Sure,
it
sure.
to the
Definitely
researchers?
we need that. Participants will definitely look out for the slides. Maybe you can do that later.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So I'll just first and foremost, I would like to thank the presenter, Ms. Diksha, for the presentation, which was extensive and informative. I'm sure this presentation must have been useful for everyone. Thank you, Diksha. Now, Dr. Kukiet and Pim will take over the session.
Oh, there's a question. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem, no problem.
Are there any article publishing charges? Yes, sure. Maybe you can answer, Dr. Tina. Yes, it's a code. Yeah, it's called open access model.
So yes, there are article processing charges that authors need to pay. For Quvae, Dr. Tina, I think you're best placed to share what are the article processing charges if a particular researcher is submitting their research through the gateway that you have provided. Apart from that, if you want to submit as an individual researcher on F1000, I am dropping in a link to our article processing charges, which are clearly mentioned on the website. So this is the link that you can check if you want to know more. But if you are in collaboration with Quvae and you want to submit through their gateway, Dr. Tina, if you'd like to share later on with them what the APC is for that, that would be great.
Yes, Dr. Kukiet will share all the details after the session.
Yes.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, I can drop off, and maybe if you'd like me to share whatever you'd like, Dr. Tina, please let me know.
Sure, Diksha. As of now, everything is fine. Thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And I have dropped my email ID in the chat. So if you want to write to me after this to know more about F1000 or open data or anything, please feel free to do so. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you, Diksha. Thank you.